Talk about machine straight stitching your quilt and how to stuff your quilt for part 7 of the Glow Quilt Along. So the materials you're going to need are a nice fresh 8012 or 9014 top stitch needle and a variety of threads that match the fabrics on the top of your quilt. So I've chosen these different threads by Aurifil. They're all a 50 weight quilting cotton. You can use polyester to quilt. Personally, I stick with cotton. There's a lot of debate on this. Have your own research on it, but it's up to you. And then also for the backing, what I'm doing, because my backing is all yellow, so I'm using a bobbin thread that's yellow, and that way I don't have to change the bobbin throughout this process. It can just stay in the machine, and it'll also blend in nicely on the back. If you want your backing thread to be a different color, that's awesome. You can play around with that. Just know that you're going to really notice if there's any squiggling in your lines or anything like that if you're using a brighter thread that sticks out. If you're sewing your Glow quilt as a puff quilt, you're going to have your backing and your top on there, and it will all be pinned up like that. So what you're going to do is sew along the seam line there. And you'll remember back when we were doing our ironing, we ironed all of the seams going in one direction. My recommendation for the Glow quilt is to top stitch that seam. So identify which direction your seams were going. So in this case, mine are going this way. So I'm going to top stitch over top of the actual seam. It's just going to give your quilt a bit more strength. And because we're quilting quite far apart on this, we're only doing one line that's going across in order to make it a bit more washing machine friendly. And also to make sure that nothing gets ripped out while you're stuffing it. I would definitely recommend taking the time to identify where your seams are and top stitch over those seams. I've already quilted my puff quilt version of this quilt, so I'm going to be working on my traditional quilt, which has the batting in it. So there's 3 layers. The beginning stages are the exact same for both, and then with the batting version, I am going to be adding a few extra stitch lines just because I like the idea of having kind of matchstick quilting on this to give it a little more character. What you want to pay attention to and what decides how close you have your stitches when you're doing a traditional quilt with the batting is how much distance the batting needs to be, how close the stitches have to be to keep the batting together, because batting is actually, it's not that strong. So if you quilt too far apart, like if I were to quilt from like here to here and not have a stitch line here, eventually in your washing machine and with use, the batting will start to fall apart and you'll end up with pilling and stuff like that, and no one wants that. So you have to check on your batting package to see how far apart it can be sewn. So I have my yellow thread in the bobbin. I have a brown thread up top, so it's going to match these first couple of colors here. And what I'm going to be doing is following along the seam and using that as my guide. So in quilting, generally, if you're doing straight line quilting, you would need to be using either, you would have marked this up using a pen or tape or something to make sure that you have a line to follow. But in this case, we have all these beautiful pre-done seams and we can just follow those. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to line up the seam directly with the center of my foot here. And I am using my walking foot, but you absolutely do not need to. You can just go really nice and slowly. And the walking foot will help if you're doing a traditional quilt and you have the 3 layers. It helps make sure that the fabrics don't all smush and move around. But if you don't have a walking foot and you're doing the puff quilt version, you don't need one at all because you're only doing 2 layers of fabric. So it's absolutely not necessary. And it's not necessary in traditional quilting either, but it is very helpful. Some tricks to make sure that your fabric doesn't move around is just kind of holding it taut, not tight, but just gently holding it all in place as you're going and moving it forward, and let your machine do the work. Let your machine pull the fabric through. You don't need to be shoving it through. Just sort of hold on and go with the machine. In order to easily follow this seam with my presser foot, what I'm doing, because of the way my foot is I'm lining up the seam directly with this center part of the foot, and then I'm just moving my needle position over 2 points, and that's going to allow the stitch line to just run right along here over top of that seam underneath. If you have a different foot, what you can do is also just line up the foot so that it's on the edge of this seam, and then move your needle position over as far as it will go, and then you can just stitch along it like that, and that lets you follow the seam without having to do any additional tape or pen or any markings on this quilt. So the key to using your walking foot well is going really nice and slowly. You want to walk that walking foot, and that's going to keep all of your pieces of fabric together and not moving around. So we're just going to slowly keep going along here, and some machines are going to have the ability to adjust the speed. Most of them will. So you can adjust your speed so that you don't have to worry about the pressure on your foot pedal as much. As we're coming up to the end here, we're just going to stitch right off the end. And you don't need to back stitch, but do stitch a little bit further out. And that's why we always like to leave a bit of extra fabric of the backing and the batting, because we want to be able to just stitch off, and then we're going to cut our thread. And this is the key part to keep your quilt from getting wrinkles, is you're going to just pull all of that fabric back, and we're going to start from the same direction again. So you're not quilting back and forth, you're quilting all in one direction. So we're going to start again, and starting a little bit off of the quilt, starting where you're hitting the backing fabric, and then you're just going to quilt on and do the same thing, and just, you know, put on a podcast, maybe watch a show if you can double task like that. I personally love listening to podcasts. As you're going to occasionally have to remove pins because they're going to get too close to your foot. So you can just go ahead and do that. If you can sort of preemptively do it before it gets too close to the foot, that's going to also just help stop the fabric moving around accidentally. So when you see one coming up, just pop it out and take it out. Another thing is that if you can have your needle in the down position when your machine stops, a lot of machines will let you do this. You can go into settings and set it so that the needle stays down every time you stop. You can see here, I start going, I stop, and the needle just automatically drops down. That's going to help avoid having your quilt shift around as you're going. As you're sewing, you'll start to notice that you start getting bulk on this side. What you can do is just roll it as you go, and make sure you roll it down at the bottom. And then that way you can just put your hand on top of the rolled part and keep pushing the fabric through. And a quick sewing tip, whenever you're changing your thread, make sure that you're cutting it up top and pulling it through from the bottom. Don't ever pull it up through the top, because that can jam up your machine with lint. So once you've finished the last seam here, we're going to sew the edges of the quilt. And what you need to keep in mind here is that the binding of your quilt, the part that goes around the edges, is going to cover about 1/4 of an inch. So you want to make sure that you're quilting just along the edge here. So if you're doing the puff quilt version, this is all the stitching that you need to do, and we're ready to move on to stuffing the quilt. If you are not doing the puff quilt version and you want to do some matchstick quilting, which is where you just have tons of lines going across, what you want to do is line up with the seam, not with your stitch, because your stitch is going to naturally be a little bit wonky. So whenever you can, line it up with the seam, and make sure that you're stitching the same direction as you stitched before. So although in this tutorial I sewed the different sections and then I'm going back and doing the matchsticking, if you want to do this version, what you should do is do the matchstick the whole way. And every time that you have the ability to line up with a seam instead of with a stitch line, that's what you want to do. For my second stitch line, I am going to be going off of these stitches. If you want to make sure that you're going to have super precise straight lines, you would definitely want to go ahead and mark that using a pen or tape or a Hera marker, which places an indent on the fabric. The matchstick version looks like this, and you want to think about the spacing of your needle and the distance, because it's important to be running along the seams of this quilt. Just because it's such a long seam, you wouldn't want to risk having that eventually come undone in the wash on the back. So what you want to do, if you want to make sure it's completely evenly spaced, is make a division between here in this seam and this seam, and then divide it by how many lines you want. So if you want 3 lines, you would measure this distance and then divide that by 3. But do not do it the way that I did, where I sewed these pieces and then did the match sticking. do the matchsticking all at once. Some tips on stuffing your puff quilt.